Money moves the world, and banking moves money. Welcome to the Public Bank Solution. Conversations about an emerging new American institution. Publicly owned partnership banks able to rebalance the scales of monetary control in service of the public interest and our commonwealth. Brought to you on behalf of the Public Banking Institute and Banking on New Jersey by Public Banking Associates in support of the national movement to create new public banks. Hello, and welcome to Public Bank Solution. I'm Walt McCree, Senior Advisor and Chair Emeritus of the Public Banking Institute and co-director of Banking on New Jersey, one of the groups working to create a public bank in the state of New Jersey. Today, we're pleased to have, for a second edition of this interview, Dr. Thomas Marois of the University of London, who is really a preeminent global academic expert on public banks and public financial institutions. He's the author of a new book called Public Banks: Decarbonization, Definancialization, and Democratization, available from Cambridge and Press, but also from Amazon. Thomas comes to us from London, where he is in a late afternoon conversation with us. Following our first section, we talked about the book. Now we want to talk about how a public bank, particularly in New Jersey, but anywhere in the country, would be able to take on the challenges that we find ourselves in as planetary residents on a planet that is giving us a much different menu of options for our future, things that will require huge capital investment. And so it's important for us to understand how we've been getting the money to be able to look after ourselves. Some would say we haven't been doing a very good job of that in many ways. Our infrastructure, the Society of Engineers gives us a D or D plus. America really has operating kind of on a 20th century world plateau. The rest of the world is doing great. You know, high-speed trains in China. There's huge improvement in infrastructure in a lot of places except here. And one of the reasons is that we are, the only way we've been thinking about financing is to look at the private markets and to look at how private capital can be brought in to make a profit on the needs that we have now to make a green economy, and not just the economy for the infrastructure, but the infrastructure of our society, of people, of human beings, of communities, how we're going to secure a safe and sustainable future and a regenerative future for all of our residents here. So with all of that, let me just welcome Thomas once again. Thomas, thank you for joining us for this edition as well.
Thank you, Walt. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to speak with you on this topic.
When we were discussing and doing this program, one of the things we wanted to focus on, particularly for New Jersey, but also for the rest of the country, is how public banks around the world, and specifically in any state, would be able to impact the need for creating a new era economy and infrastructure. Tell us a little bit about the public financial institutions around the world that are making that kind of impact. And how
sure. Thanks for the chance to speak about this, because it's so important, and it's really the reason why I do what I do, is to begin to share these stories, these narratives, and to inspire this kind of change. And in areas like sort of global decarbonization or green and just transitions, I often say that public banks are the linchpin for this. That we're not going to get there unless public banks are in some way involved, or in many ways catalyzing, leading this change for decarbonization or global green and just transformations. And there are many ways that public banks, both development banks or infrastructure banks, but also more local community banks that are still publicly owned or cooperatively owned, are at the forefront of this. Mm-hmm. And infrastructure is certainly one way, and it's historic. In many cases, public banks have been involved in infrastructure, the building of roads, the building of transportation, municipal infrastructure, hospitals, schools. The list goes on. We know we know all of that. In terms of offering supportive, what we can call patient or long-term loans at affordable rates, at conditions that enable public authorities or municipalities or states or national governments even to provide the infrastructure that a society needs stably without risk of the investor pulling out and destabilizing the project or demanding certain conditions of it that then undermine the ability of a community to build the best infrastructure possible. And there's so many examples we can look at, to be honest. I often like pointing to, there's this bank called the Nordic Investment Bank, which is a multinational bank, relatively small, invests about 5-6 billion euros a year in the North. It's owned by Nordic communities plus the Baltic ones.
It's Nordic, N-O-R-D-I-K?
Yeah, the Nordic Investment Bank,
Okay.
Sweden, Finland, Norway, Iceland, forgetting what country. Anyway, but they've invested in sort of green, sustainable hydro energy in a northern community to supply green, renewable energy to several municipalities. But they also built the station, and I have pictures of it in some work that I've done in the past, I think a 2017 paper for the Transnational Institute, where they built the station where they're generating it and got a special architect to come in to make it beautiful. And it is a stunning installation of renewable energy. And their logic was to inspire the youth of the country to hike up there and see how you can generate renewable energy, and then become that in itself become a transformational moment of what you can do with public money for the future. You can look at other institutions. There's another brand new institution called the Finnish Climate Fund that has set very firm floor where basically it says we're not going to fund any investment, public or private, unless you first demonstrate to us that you're going to decarbonize the environment. And so it sets this condition. It's a foundation for investment and then moves forward from there, in terms of looking at, the viability of it, what kind of impact it's going to have for jobs and so on. But in many ways, it's endless. We can, as far as our sort of imagination and what our demands of our community are, we can craft a public bank to confront and address those challenges in ways that are green and societally equitable and sustainable financially, and even profitable for the community in which it exists.
Yeah, so in the US, green banks, what are called green banks, are basically public-private partnerships, or they have perhaps some public funding, but then as an agency, it will go out and seek private partnership to create a profit-making opportunity for investment. So they're not public banks. They're green in the sense that they have this commitment to invest in this sector. But by and large, the United States really doesn't have a really robust public commitment to building green infrastructure. Not yet. It's certainly talked about a lot, and we all know we know it needs to happen. And there's a lot of lip service to. I would just say there are some bills in Congress that would move this forward. But in many cases, the public-private partnership is the model that the United States and that the legislators and policy people refer to, because they don't understand what a public bank could be doing. Well, you had mentioned just now in the Nordic Bank, this beautiful public-public partnership where the public bank partnered with the public agency. Give us an example of how that might work, let's say here in New Jersey, in terms of working with, we have a rail system called New Jersey Transit that needs a lot of upgrading. There's a desire on the part of a lot of citizen groups to electrify our transportation fleet and so forth. How would that work if we had a state bank to be able to support that transition through those agencies?
Wow, that's a big question. Well, I've got big ideas on that. And
Great, shoot 'em.
I mean, in these kinds of situations, I like to point to the possibilities of public-public collaboration. And my view on public banks is that they should really become a hub, a center of expertise, not only of expertise and knowledge on how to coordinate these really massive kind of projects of electrification of public transport. It's big, right?
Yeah.
But they also, of course, as a bank, become the source of finance, of capital for that. And one way you can begin to look at that is banks, of course, magnify existing money. So they'll have an initial sort of capital reserve, but then they can lend out 5, 10, 15, 20 times that.
Mm.
And so they can magnify scarce resources. But they also, and this is the model in much of Europe, is that when they need additional capital, then they reach out into the international financial markets, and then they begin to pull in into international flows of finance, but on their own terms, right? They offer bonds and they say, we'll pay X%. And then the financiers come in and say, okay, we'll buy up your bonds. Often, and increasingly so, they're labeled as green bonds. So then that provides a sort of check mark for the investment funds, for the pension funds, and so on. Yeah. That money goes into the bank, and then they direct them. That green bond then goes into green investments, like, say, a new solar farm or a large offshore wind installation, which are expensive and significant, in terms of their capacity. And so in that sense, the public bank really becomes a center of coordinating that and creating a large-scale investment like a wind farm that then can feed into the greening of public transports in ways that is supportive. It creates long-term investment in it. It creates jobs in terms of building the wind farms, and then it supports the community in terms of providing green public transport that is decarbonized. And hopefully creating some knock-on benefits in terms of accessibility and setting conditions around the types of loans they provide and so on for both jobs, but also in terms of decarbonization. There are a number of ways that this can also connect other public-public collaborations. You can think about the ways, I've often talked about the ways that public water provisioning is costly and it takes a lot of energy to pump around water around communities, right? Mm-hmm. But they also have big fields. They often store water or provide the pumping services. You set solar panels there and begin to generate green energy on already existing public land to green the pumping of energy around. You can look to public pension funds to begin investing through the public bank into those. And we saw this in COVID, where a number, particularly in Europe, through the public banks, public pension funds or public-private or cooperative insurers were directly investing in the public banks to support their efforts to respond to COVID. Very similar practices we can learn from in terms of responding to the climate crisis. And it's very low-hanging fruit. It's something that can be coordinated as a matter of policy, but it takes a political vision or a political will, willing to sort of create that legacy. And a public bank really is about creating a legacy. And we see this around the world, that where they were created, in many cases decades ago, when the crisis comes, they're in place and capable of responding. And without that, then you get all kinds of like the messed up responses like we see in the United Kingdom or in the US, where the response support funds are getting hived off for all kinds of nefarious projects and so on. And they're not going to the public purpose for which they were meant.
Yeah, we certainly saw it in a great example in North Dakota. Not only was the emergence of the Bank of North Dakota 102 years ago a response to the abusive, exploitive aspect of Wall Street finance, but not too many years after it was founded, a fire and flood on Grand Forks wiped out the North Dakota city, as well as the twin city across the river in Minneapolis or in Minnesota. The public bank in North Dakota stepped right in. They were there before anybody else and said, hey, here's some money, clean it up, let's get things back in order. And they only lost 3% of their population. Across the way, Minnesota had to go to New York, had to pay high cost, and they lost about almost 20% of their population. So a huge difference in potential when the people are in the driver's seat. You mentioned
I would really emphasize that, and because it is such an important, like sort of foundational difference, that public purpose. And I hear this time and again within public banks, that at times of crisis, we function according to our public purpose, in the case of the better public banks, and that this is important. It's an ethos, a culture of the bank. Mm-hmm. And in, just as one past, interview I did many years ago, at a time of crisis, I was talking to a local bank manager of a public bank in another country. He said, yeah, when it starts raining, we don't put our umbrella away, right? And in terms of the public bank, when the crisis hits, that's exactly, one of the moments when we really need to have this. And we're in a crisis now, a climate crisis, a COVID crisis, and the evidence speaks for itself that those countries with public banks and public banks that are accountable and transparent and function according to public purpose are making a fundamental difference in those countries and communities' capacity to respond to both COVID and the climate crisis.
You mentioned public banks that are well run and have a foundational root commitment. What kind of examples do you have for public banks that don't work with that kind of integrity?
So we see some of this became exposed in the lead up to the 2007-09 global financial crisis. Mm-hmm. And in Europe, you see some of the local Caja Populares, like community banks, or in Germany, there was some sort of publicly owned or partially publicly owned investment banks or Landesbanks that have begun to speculate on subprime mortgages. And the problem there is that they began to take on a mandate to maximize profitability rather than maximize public purpose. And once that happens, then public banks begin to function very much like private profit-seeking banks, and they often get into trouble. Any observer of public banks can also point to a number of historical examples where they've certainly been abused by political authorities through corruption and so on, and caused problems. And this is precisely why that last D in my title, democratization, is so important. Mm-hmm. We absolutely must demand of past, existing, and future public banks that they are accountable and transparent and create mechanisms both within that bank for democratic governance, but also sort of transparent rules that really enforce that and make that a legal requirement, that public banks have to respond and report to the public on its activities and be accountable and responsible for what they do. There's no avoiding it. We must demand that of new public banks.
And that's where your word just comes in for me, that our banks should be green, but also just. And so that part of the agenda of the bank is to reclaim, recover, recoup, reinvigorate, renew our relationships, our commitment to each other in the form of public policy. And of course, in public policy, it can't happen without the financial resources to do that. One of the aspects of the loans that you were talking about was conditionality. Again, that conditionality seems to reflect that. Could you talk a little bit about how a public bank would condition being a pass-through for other investments? You touched on it a minute ago.
Sure. The conditionality is a means of enacting or effecting public purpose and the goals and aspirations of the community. So if you have, and this has been an increasing discussion within the public bank movement in the US, but it's part of the way public banks function around much of the world. So for example, if it's public purpose, if it has a green mandate or a mission, The public banks like the German KfW or the Finnish funds, or in fact, the French, the Dutch, let's go on. I can give you any number of public banks that do this, set conditions in terms of the loan that they're offering, that they must decarbonize. They must reduce net carbon emissions in one way or another. There are other ones where they also, we can begin speaking about conditionalities that set requirements for the recipient to ensure just labor requirements, so that there are permanent long-term jobs out of that come with the investment. So if you're building a large wind farm off the coast of New Jersey, well, let's make sure that those jobs are permanent, long-term, and sustainable jobs. Similarly, we can also begin to discuss things like gender equity, representation, and be building those into the loans and form of conditionality. And depending on the relationship with the government, the government itself can create all kinds of incentives to really drive loans in a particular direction and to encourage society to move along. So again, the German KfW will often provide loans to municipalities or to industry based on a decarbonization or a sustainability agenda, already at preferable long-term supportive rates. But if the municipality or the industry exceeds the expectations of the loan, then they get a top-up bonus, right?
Wow.
In terms of the repayment. And so it really is able to bend and really begin to reshape society and markets and the ways in which we produce energy or use energy in a more sustainable and just trajectory.
Yeah, that's you gave some really interesting examples. I was thinking that it would be neat to take a look at what some of the things that are like Germany and other countries are doing for investing in green. What are some of the jobs? Retrofitting, we know about solar and wind and so forth. What are some of the other things that people, let's say in New Jersey, could maybe look forward to in our society and our economy once we get our state bank underway?
What other kinds of investments might
Yeah, well, just wondered what kind of projects that are involved in the green decarbonization arena.
Well, I mean, right now,
retrofitting, for example, retrofitting.
Yes. So some of the key ones are clearly the large, green energy, the wind farms and the solar, which are absolutely key. But there's also a real push that I've been seeing both from within municipalities and communities, but also within public banks for things like retrofitting. So it's great, to put heat pumps in houses or to change, decarbonize or move to electrical heating of large buildings. But until you begin to retrofit those buildings and make the buildings themselves energy efficient, much of that investment in better, more efficient heating units is going to be wasted. And so I think there's such a promising and important role that public banks can play in terms of retrofitting community house, so existing public housing stock, so social housing. Encourage that in new builds in terms of high quality, energy efficient homes, but also in terms of industrial retrofits, providing the kinds of loans, supportive programs, but also building up the expertise and the know-how of how to enact and to effect that kind of change within the bank is an absolutely key element to the future of public banks. And really, if you're thinking in a place like New Jersey of a starting point for a new public bank, well, create one with a mission to retrofit houses. And you've got an immediate market, you've got an immediate need, you've got something that's going to respond to the necessities of transitioning to a low carbon future, and you're going to be creating long-term sustainable jobs and knowledge within your community. I mean, it's a win-win-win-win-win type of project that kicks off a public bank, gives it a project, builds its expertise and capacity, and connects it to its community, so that bank is seen to be doing something for the people who own it right away, rather than going off in some obscure corner where who knows what the public bank is doing. Let's connect it to community. Let's show that it's doing something for us and with us.
Yeah. Well, it is, unfortunately, we've run out of time here, Thomas, but I want to give you a chance to just maybe close up, give us a closing statement, and then we're going to have to say goodbye for now anyway. So, but any
Sure.
closing comments?
I just, I'm not American by birth, but I'm connected very much to the community and to the movements within the U.S. And I think there is a real opportunity here in New Jersey and in many states across the United States of America to begin creating this legacy for the future of the capacity to democratically command the money and resources in your community to create the kind of change, positive, green, and just future that you want to see. And without doing this, you're spinning your wheels in mud. And it really is sort of one of those necessary things that has to occur, to create the change you want. And I would just say, jump on board. It's time to, really, solidify that political will behind it and move forward.
Yeah, well said. It's, Victor Hugo said, no idea more powerful than an idea whose time has come, and the time has come. We've had enough of the misfortune of having to pay so much for borrowing money when we should really be creating it our own credit. Dr. Thomas Marois, thanks so much, Thomas, for being with us for this conversation, and we will look to have more of them with you. Dr. Thomas Marois is a research associate and a lecturer at the University of London. He's really the preeminent global scholar and academic on public banks, and has a new book. He's written several books, but his latest book is called Public Banks, Decarbonization, Definancialization, and Democratization. DDD, okay, and it is available. And as he indicated in our last segment, you can get a discount on that book by putting in what, Thomas?
Through Cambridge, if you put the discount code of Marois21, so MAROIS 21, and you'll get a 20% discount.
Well, that's great. Yeah, it certainly is an important a document for us all to get familiar with. And the U.S. is kind of pulling up the tail end in this public banking world. But you've beautifully described how public banks are about creating a different bottom line, not about profitability, but about relationship around society, around sustainability, regenerative spirit, and also integrity, transparency, accountability. These are all things that we don't have in our financial matrix right now. So as New Jersey and the other states around the country continue their discovery of how to do this, we really appreciate your leadership, Thomas, in showing the way and articulating the particular aspects that can be done, realized, and aimed for as we move forward. Thanks once again, Thomas. And
thank you very much. My pleasure.
Yeah, and thank you one and all for joining us on the Public Bank Solution. Look forward to seeing you again. The Public Bank Solution is produced for the Public Banking Institute and Banking on New Jersey by Public Banking Associates, a national consultancy advising government leaders interested in creating their own public banks.